Hello and welcome to another Procreate tutorial where today we're going to go ahead and create this misty mountain scene where you can go ahead and grab the canvas size, the palette and anything else that is required for today's design in the description down below. So once you've grabbed all of those requirements, you'll have everything you'll need in order to get started with today's design. Now this one, especially when we get into the mountain scene, you're going to end up in a couple of different stages. It's going to be an initial sort of spread of color which is very messy. I want you to enjoy it. I want you to just to be really loose with it. And then we're going to go ahead and use another brush on top of that to add in finer details. So don't stress over sort of the details early on. We're chucking in some color, then we'll add in some very loose details. And we're just going to use the Taralea brush and the Leatherwood brush to create some simple sort of shapes and textures back there. And as you can see from this finished version, we add mist, we add in a little bit of a fade at the bottom. So a lot of your design may even be hidden. So try not to stress over it early doors. And if you didn't already know, I post weekly tutorials here on my YouTube channel, but I also post 3 more exclusive tutorials every single month to my patrons. The catalogue sits at over 70, nearly 80 at the time of recording. If you want to get access to that exclusive catalogue, hit the link in the description down below and come and show your support. And with all that said, let's get started. So once you've created your canvas, you can see that I've actually added in a little grid there. So we're going to go up to our actions. We're going to go ahead and turn on the drawing guide. And if you go to edit the drawing guide, you're just going to want to set your grid size to 300. That will be dependent on if you followed the exact same canvas size. If you didn't, you're going to have to make accommodations accordingly until you have 6 across the top and 4 down, and then hit done when you're done. We're only using that just so we can make sure things are laid out in the sort of spaces that I want them to occupy. So we're going to get started with adding in the basic shapes. So if we go to our layers, I'm going to go ahead and on the first empty layer, I'm going to go to my colors. I'm going to get started by dropping in the background color, which will be this color here in the bottom right of the palette, and we'll drag that onto the screen. So we're going to make our way now from back to front, adding in all the different shapes. So we're going to go to our layers. We're going to create a new layer. We're going to go to our colors and we're going to grab this color here at the bottom of the 5th column. We're going to go to our brush and I'm going to use the option of calligraphy and the monoline brush. And if I tap on the monoline, the stabilization is set to a little bit sort of quite low really. I usually have a little bit of stabilization there, and the streamline is also very low, just so we can get some natural sort of jitters in here and some nice rocky shapes. Now my size is going to be set to 1%. You can set that a little bit larger if you wish, but as long as we have our empty layer, we can go ahead and start to plan this out. Now we're going to sort of plan out that there'll be a peak here, one just beside it. We're going to end up with another one somewhat over here and one here too. We're going to end up with a shape that's almost like this, where we're going to just sort of run our pen along there. So that's roughly what we're going to aim for. So we're going to make our way through all the tiles and just make little shapes as we go. So I'm going to start over here and then I'm going to immediately sort of bring that up onto a ledge and then a peak somewhat there, and just let that kind of run off down here. And we can always adjust the shape afterwards, as I mentioned. Now from this sort of grid over here, we're going to go ahead and just create like a little bit of a landscape where it runs up here and then maybe it dips down but then makes its way back up again, and then we'll make our main sort of point peak here, let that run down, and then we'll create like another one here on the right hand side. Now as long as you've linked up all your lines, you should be able to drag and drop your color in, and then we can just take a look at the shape that we've created and make any adjustments. For example, I'm going to just bring in a bit more of a slope down towards this one here, drag and drop that in, and just keep making some adjustments to my layout just so that I'm happy with it. And I can smooth out some of these. They don't need to be sort of quite dips and valleys. They can be quite smooth. We can make them look quite deep and sort of quite big grooves to them in a moment with our sort of shading, etc. So we don't have to always make them dip down like this into a V. We can very much sort of let them just naturally run into the shape just beside it. We dictate what it looks like in the end by, again, our highlights and our shadows. Now I am going to go ahead and just make this one a little bit more pointy, or have a bit more of a purposeful peak at the top there, like a little something like that, just so we've got like a very big main focal point. Now over here on the left, I'm just going to adjust this as well, where I want to bring that peak just a little bit further over, give it a little bit more of its own space, a little something like that. And then maybe we actually just make that a little bit taller again and create a little bit of a dip just there. We can always adjust shapes, and this is always the best time to do it. You don't want to be doing it too late in your design. Adjusting the shape now will just kind of give you that basic idea of what you want to sort of do with your layout. And then maybe we just bring that in a little bit higher on the side there. So a little something like that. We're then going to go to our layers and create another new layer. We're going to go to our colors. We're going to go ahead and we're going to grab this color here. It's the bottom of that third column from the right. And we're going to introduce another set of sort of mountain-esque hills. And we're going to start over here and we're just going to sort of run down through into here. And then we're going to create a little sort of mini peak here. And then just let that run out into like another higher area on the right. And then drag and drop your coloring. We'll go to our layers, create another new layer. We'll go to our colors. We're going to go ahead and we're going to grab this color here, second color on the top row from the right hand side. And we're going to introduce another sort of hilltop here where we're going to introduce all sort of like a level of forest. So I'm going to make that quite substantial and let that just dip off and run out to the right. It doesn't really matter over here on the right because it will be hidden in a moment. Next, we'll add in our front area here. So we'll go to our layers, we'll create another new layer. We'll go to our colors and we'll use the color in the top right of the palette. And we're going to introduce a hill that just makes its way from sort of down here up towards here and then up here. So that's kind of your rough guide as to what we're going to aim for. And we're going to bring that in, going to just bring in a lovely big hill and then let that really just drop down into a bit of a valley. And then it maybe just shoots up here on the right hand side where we've got like a high ledge for some reason. And then we'll drag and drop the coloring. So a little something like that. You can maybe drop that down a little bit to be honest, but we'll come back to it afterwards. So we've got all the basic shapes that we need for a moment in order to get started. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and grab this layer here, those sets of mountains, and just bring them a little bit higher just so we can see a bit more of them. And I'm actually going to go ahead and grab the color for that, which is this bottom of the third column from the right, and just make a little bit of an adjustment where I can just maybe just let that be a bit more visible in there. Just joining those two edges together a bit more and then just adding in a bit more character into this space. There we go. So with that done, we can now go ahead and start to work on the layers and we'll do exactly the same. We'll work from back to front. So down here where we've got this base layer of our sky, we're going to go ahead and go to our colors and we're going to grab the color just beside it. So it's the bottom row, second column from the right. And we're going to go to our layers and create another new layer. We're going to go to our selection tool. We're going to use the option of freehand and we're going to tap on color fill so it turns blue and that means we're using it. And I'm just going to go tap, tap, bit of a diagonal shape and then just cover this right hand side and then tap on the dot and it'll fill in that space. We can then tap on our selection tool, go to our adjustments. We can go to the option of gauge and blur and we can swipe from left to right until it is completely blurred out. And we're going to go all the way up to something around about sort of 65%. That just gives us a light blue to a dark blue transition at that sky level. So I'm going to go up to 75% there. We're then going to go to our layers and create another new layer. Go to our colors. I'm going to grab the middle color on that far right column. And our brush, we're going to set to airbrushing and the soft brush. And opacity is maxed and the size can be around about sort of 20%. We're going to go left to right, just in behind our mountains here, left to right, and just blending up a beautiful pink, sort of a little bit of just sunny hue on that sky there. Just a little bit in behind your mountains. You can always bring it down if you need to, inside your layers. Then we're going to go ahead and move towards the mountain. Now at this point, if you're happy with your sky, you can either swipe from left to right and group them all together, or you can flatten the group, whichever you feel more comfortable with. We're then going to tap on our mountain. We're going to create a new layer and then tap on it and clipping mask it. We're going to go to our colors. We're going to get started with adding in some of the bright tones, which is going to be this bottom color here in that third column. We're going to go to our brush library. We're going to go to artistic and we're going to use the Taralea brush. And we're going to start with the brush in the 5% size and the opacity set to 75%. Now, you kind of want to sort of plan out a little bit where you want your highlights to be. So for example, if I drop this down to a small size, maybe around about, it's okay, I can use the 2% just as a quick guide for you. Each one of your peaks, the right hand side over here is essentially going to be colored in. So now we can go ahead and just start to plan out, okay, do we want to bring that down here? Then where do we want it to go? Maybe we'll create another sort of peak here where it's a peak in front of us. It's not on the sort of main shape of it. And then maybe we sort of bring that line across into this area here. And then all of your other peaks, you can go ahead and just draw down them and then just decide where you want the highlight to go. So I'm rounding it off. And then obviously the right side here, I can color that in essentially and do that. So we're going to follow that kind of rule now with the Taralea at the 5% brush size. We're just going to sort of come down here, keep your pressure nice and light, and then maybe create like another peak here and maybe it sort of runs off over to this area here. Now we're using the Taralier because we can layer up lots of sort of variation in the color. So I'm brightening up the right hand side of this peak as well, the right hand side of this peak, and then bringing that across. Keep it nice and loose. You don't have to be too sort of strict with this part. We'll then bring the brush size to the smaller size. I've got let's go to this size, sorry, again the 5%, and maybe just a little sort of splash of color on that top peak there, just a little something. And then I want to leave primarily this area nice and dark, so we'll sort of bring this in as if it's like a peak in front, and just let that kind of just run down and around. And then this area here is going to be in the shade, so this is your highlighted areas. Now I've just made a very quick change to the sort of shape up here. I just needed that to have a little bit more of a peak to it and a bit more of a right side to it. That way now I've got more space to add in this area of color. So we're using the Taralier to keep it nice and sort of smudgy, really easy. We're then going to go to our colors and we're going to grab the color up from it. So it's the middle color in that third column. We're going to go ahead and bring the brush size down now. So if you can get like a 3%, we can get rid of that too. We'll make it a 3% if it'll allow us, or a large 2%. And then we're going to go ahead and just now start to sort of brighten up, and then start to think about sort of creating sort of avenues and how the rock works. You know, at the top here, we kind of want to push quite down in a bit more of a vertical fashion, just to show a little bit more of the verticality to it. And then maybe here in the middle of the mountain, the lines start to drift off to the right. We can definitely refine this area here a bit more, kind of making that into a bit more of a brighter spot as if it is its own peak. And then just again let those lines run off. And again here, maybe we introduce a bit more of a brighter tone on here, where I can kind of see another peak forming, and that runs into a flat area. And then let's just imagine that all these lines just sort of start to move down in a bit more of a vertical fashion, like there's a really harsh drop in the sort of stone of the mountain. So you end up with this flat spot. So your movement of your brush really just shows someone the surface that it is you're creating. So if I'm nice and vertical here, it shows quite that steep incline and decline even in the rock. And then the sort of flatter areas where you go horizontal do exactly that. They sort of flatten the surface a bit more. We can just very lightly just dash in a bit of extra color here and there, and we'll brighten up this area here too, and push that into here. We'll add in a tiny little splash on the back area there. And then we're going to go ahead and move into this area here too. So simple principle again. We're going to sort of try to create that landscape, and maybe once you create like a flat line that runs down, you can then start to create those vertical lines, just pushing down a little bit. These are our basic shapes, so don't stress over this too much right now. We're just trying to get in some basic elements of where the highlights are sitting and where sort of the shadows will ultimately be, which we'll get onto shortly. So once we've sort of added in like lovely little patchwork, we can then go to our colors and move up a color to this color here, the top of that third column. And we'll keep it at the 2% for a minute. We'll go down this top end here again, and then just tapping away. And our highlights are primarily going to get a little bit brighter towards that top area where the sun is going to break through and really kiss the mountain surface. So I'm just going to dash in here a little bit more, dash into this area here. Little sort of flicks in there. Again, still basic shapes, so don't stress. I'm now pushing that highlight a little bit further back. Maybe try and blend these two together a bit more. And you want to kind of just occasionally just do this, you know, little sort of areas and just patches of color. Just, you know, varying up the surface a bit more. Here at the back, I'm going to focus this towards the top end only, and then just let that color just sit there. And you can see how messy it is. That's what we want right now. We want that variety in the color. Now we're going to go ahead and move into some of the shaded areas. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this color, the middle color in the fifth column there. And we're going to get started with just on the back end of this mountain, on the same layer, just now start to overlap a little bit, and then create the shapes that we want in this area. So I'm imagining that there's like a big kind of dip here in the surface. You can kind of make the person who's looking at this aware of that by creating this lovely curve in here. And this goes all the way up behind this little peak here that we created, and a little somewhat in there. And then up here, maybe we just push the pen down a bit more in a more vertical fashion to kind of show it goes steep down and then deep into this curved valley where the land starts to sort of push out a bit more. And then you can create like a little sort of avenue here, and again, just where the direction you point your pen in and you keep making these little dashes is going to create a little random surface. But when you zoom out, you can see that curvature. And then up here, I'll do the same. I'll create those lovely, quite vertical lines just up here, just to really show how it just drops down into this space that we're trying to create here. Leave it nice and patchy, leave some gaps in there. Likewise on the back of this mountain peak here. And then, okay, well, let's start to think about how much of a casted shadow does this create, you know? This peak here, let it push across over to the top of here. All this orange is totally dependent on the fact of where the lighting is. So if we're creating a lovely long casted shadow here, likewise from here onto here too, we're really showing the direction as if the light is just here and it's really pushing across onto the mountain. Here I can really like make this peak go quite far across if I want. Likewise there too, and that shadow immediately starts to really add some more dynamic lighting. Likewise up here, we'll now start to sort of add in a few extra bits under there. Maybe we run this into some of here just to create like a little groove and a gap. You can have so much fun creating a little random landscape. And then at the bottom here, I'm just adding in a little bit more where the lighting's not touching, so it's really falling out of that space. And again, we're keeping it super simple, super messy. We're going to go to our colors and we're going to go ahead and we're going to move up to the top color in that fifth column. Same brush again, and this is a slightly different tone. It's going to be a little bit more sort of stony, a little bit more of a an orangey, sort of very muted orangey brown color. And we're going to add in a little bit here and just in these areas to sort of splash in some variety in the surface colors. So we're still trying to follow that momentum. So make sure you follow your lines that you've created. For example, I created a line there. I got rid of it. And now I can just continue on that area here. Maybe a little splash of this in behind that peak there. And then here, maybe that line that I initially created. We'll just dance some of this on as if it's just snow in the shade almost. So we can dance that on there, and then maybe a little sort of few dashes up here on the top, keeping it super messy. Just have fun with it right now. But you're already building up that surface. Again, on the back end of some of these, we'll just dash in a little bit up on there, just a little bit. Likewise over here, we'll dash in a tiny bit, like so. Then we're going to go ahead and go to our colors and grab this color. It's the darkest tone for our darkest areas. So it's the bottom of the fourth column, all on its own. And we're going to introduce some shaded areas. So now we're going to overlap some of these colors that we just introduced. And like, for example, behind some of these peaks, I'm going to really put that in there. And we mentioned about the sort of the casted shadows across. You know, we want to create some real dark areas that the light is just really not touching at all. So like in behind that mountain at the top there, the peak, just added in a bit there, got rid of some of the colors. You know, we are going to eliminate things. So it's why you don't want to be too precious. And it's why I keep sort of mentioning, you know, keep it nice and messy. Here, I can bring this peak in front by just adding in a bit of a shadow and then swooping that out so it runs down in towards that little valley that we created. Up here, maybe on the back end, introduce a couple of little darker patches. We want this lovely variety in the colors. We want all four of these colors to provide us with the space and the shapes. Here where that little avenue I can see just forming, just darken up into there. A couple of dashes over your lighter patches, and you should be able to create more of a dynamic looking scene with this darker tone. And then here, just on the back of the peak, just smudge it out towards some of those little light sort of bluey purpley tones we created, not filling out that whole space, but just, you know, introducing a little bit more of a darker tone on the back end. Here, I'm going to bring in some of this darker color from the bottom though. Really get into like this groove here and darken that up. And you can just dash a couple of times in your lighter areas to create just little areas of rock that are just not getting the light. We're keeping this again super messy. Maybe down here we just create like the odd sort of dash line that's just running in this area. This is where we're going to start to see sort of a blending of the two sides. So we've got this sort of little shadow here just coming up from the bottom into these areas, and then where maybe you've got a gap that you can blatantly see, you know, you can run like a little sort of darker tone in there. It's just a groove that's not facing your light source. Should end up with a little sort of basic structure like this. Now I've actually just made a tiny adjustment to this peak over here where I've just made it a slightly different shape. So I'm just going to start to just darken up in behind there. Just didn't have enough of a peak look to it for me. So now we've done our sort of basic layout of our colors. We're going to go to our layers and create another new layer. We'll tap on it and we'll clipping mask it. We're going to go to our colors and grab the bottom color in the third column. And our brush wants to be set to the Leatherwood edited by myself, number 1. For you, it will be under imported right at the very bottom. And we're going to jump between a 3 and a 1% brush size. So I'm going to use the 3 to start with, and the opacity set to 75%. And all the angles, etc., that we started to work on a second ago, you're now going to really get into the point of refinement on them. So like down here, we're going to go ahead and start to sort of angle our pen at quite vertical fashion, just to really add this in. And what it's going to do, it's going to give you these little quite crispy paint details in here. And that's going to help us just add in some levels of detail. So we're going to continue that on, and then maybe we create like a little avenue here that runs off to the side. So we're going to get quite creative now with where we add in our colors. And again, it's going to be built up on top of what you've already done. So here, for example, behind this peak, I can start to maybe drag. And I love this brush because you don't know where it's going to land sometimes. Sometimes it might not catch at all on the screen, and I love that. But then a couple of vertical ones just in behind this peak. And we can let that run all the way up to the top because we can overlap it in a second. We're going to almost repeat the process we did a second ago with the colors, but now with this more refined version of the brush. So the Tara layer got us with our basic shapes, and now we can go ahead and introduce all these finer details. And it is quite a random one. You are at the mercy of the brush, but that I quite like. So I'm going to introduce some lines over here, keeping it nice and sort of angled quite harshly, quite sharp down, and occasionally you can create like this big swooping line, like a little something like that. When you zoom out, it's going to start to get a little bit more detailed, and you're going to really see all these little avenues and nooks and crannies in the mountain shape that you've created. So like there, I can just run this down, and I know we've got our shadows here, and we're going to reintroduce those as well. So I'm just going to go at the top, just try and create a couple more sort of avenues, and trying to push the lines and where I want the flow of the mountain to run to and from down here. And we're with the 3% for a moment because we want to get sort of the basic lines in here, just trying to get, you know, where that goes straight down and then it kind of runs off here and then it moves across here. It might look quite messy, but it has that painting aesthetic which I mentioned in the intro. You know, we want to keep this somewhat loose and nice and easy, nice and sort of mentally quite free. Now we'll move across over to here as well, because we do need to go ahead and start to sort of think about this as well. So I'm going to bring that down, almost as if these darker reds are just like areas that are somewhat close to the light, but not quite enough. And I'm going to bring that back in a bit more. I think I got rid of that avenue. So I'm going to paint that in, push these lines down the mountainside. If you have like a couple of shadows in your lighter spots, it's going to look great, especially later on when we overlap on top of it. And come down here. Just want to refine this shape a bit more, block that in. Let's go to our colors and let's move up a color to this one in the middle of that third column. We'll move across back over to here, and we'll again just start to now build up on top of those, and you overlap some of those dark tones because we're using the 75%. You'll end up with like this 25% overlap, which will look fantastic. So I'm going to reduce the brush size at this point to the 1% brush size and really try and just make sure now all my little sort of streaks that I add in are going to be really crispy and quite defined. So like here, I want to really make sure that this peak gets quite a good solid color just on this edge here. Then I can push that out over towards the shadowy side. And when you introduce these tiny little specks, I mean, look how far zoomed in we are. When you introduce these tiny little sort of specks and stuff that run over into the shadows, it really helps the two sides just transition. You don't have to add in a boatload of them, but just enough that you can, you know, just allow those two sides just to merge quite naturally into one another. Here we'll do the same, just introduce like the odd tiny little speck here and there, and then let that line just run off, run all the way down into here. I'm going to get over the top and I'm just following my line. So again, I'm just going to create that horizontal kind of line in this space and then let that run down and get over the top of some of my shadow lines. Again, this might look really messy, but I promise you it just makes its way out later on, especially when we add the highlights. So we're going to get through this now, just really squiggling our pen up and down, following those lines that we created, seeing what we can fall on top of, what can we carry on with. Pushing it in. You can see now I'm getting into the point where I'm starting to scribble a little bit more and just let that pen just run riot. And then a couple of, again, little break offs on the side. following that flow of the shape all the way down here. A couple more in those shadowy spots, just a little bit like that. Now let's go to our colors and go to the top color before we make our way across and then down here. So we're going to grab this top color and then bright spots again. So you can get up here, introduce those lovely bright spots. Verticality will look great. Lots of vertical lines in there, and then let that run off. A couple more vertical lines here as well. Now this line work that you're adding in now really will be quite apparent through the rest of the design. So what you add at this point will really sort of stay put. And again, zoom out. And when I zoom out with a style like this, I can start to see how all those sort of little sort of lines and everything that's running over the top of each other starting to really come to life, in a sense of just lots of small little avenues and runways and how the rock's running across each other. And it's so random. It's just meant to be, again, sort of ultra loose, brightening up the sort of top areas. So we're leaving the bottom areas a little bit darker, and please don't spend too much time in this area down here, because we're going to add a little sort of fade out later on, so that will be sort of hidden quite a bit. But this vertical is what I want you to focus on, these vertical couple of lines here and there, just to really show the verticality of the surface. And you know, maybe we can be really bold and like in here, you know, we'll just literally draw in some quite steep lines, like it just drops off. It drops really harshly down into here. And we can continue to keep adjusting it, but when I zoom out, I can see that now. I can understand how that surface just goes boom, disappears. There we go. Now let's go into the shadows as well, do the same thing. So we're going to go to our colors. We'll go ahead and we'll grab that base color again, the bottom of that fifth column, and we're going to just do the same. We're going to get back in here. We're going to start to run this pen following the same direction of all the lines that we wanted before. So I want to introduce this kind of like curling little bit of land here in this space. And again, we'll go over it with our highlight tones shortly afterwards. But at this point, we're just redefining those shapes up here, a bit more vertical, quite vertical, and maybe that runs across that top ridge. Gets a little bit more vertical here. Overlap some of your highlight tones, especially on this mountain here. This peak here is almost being blocked completely. At the top, I want these lovely vertical lines. And then here, following that curve into that little curved valley, just in there. And then we'll introduce some nice vertical lines that really don't connect, but they just show the step off and the drop down. A little bit something like this. Let's do the same up here, some more vertical lines just like we were doing before. And then there's like a little ledge here, and then it runs off down here. So I hope you're enjoying this process. I know it's a little bit random. I know we're at the mercy of the pen, but I love these styles. I love when we can just chuck it in a real easy way, and by the end you'll end up with a really cool design, hopefully, that you like the look of. This brush is just going to give us that little bit more detail to it. Let's move across to this space here while we're over here. We'll get into there, introduce those vertical lines in here too. Introduce some in there, and then let those lines run off the back, cross over each other, go along that top edge, whatever you want, like so. Let's then also get into these shadowy areas here. So we do want to make sure, even though they are our shadows, we do want to make sure that they've got some lovely sort of crispy little details in there with this brush. Just gonna put them in behind there, a couple of sort of beaming straight lines out behind it. Let's get into this area here too. Let's maybe just see if we can transition that from side to side a little bit more. Let's then go to our colors. Let's move to the one above it, so the middle color in that fifth column. Let's go ahead then, and we're using a brighter tone now, so we can really again start to follow all of the colors. So you're basically looking for where you put the color before, and now just sort of going over the top of it, and this brush and all your other sort of darker spots, and just creating all that variation in color tone. So up here, we'll get up here and we will introduce some sort of quite vertical lines. A couple of little drop-offs there. Zoom out, please don't get lost in those details for too long. Up here as well, a couple more, following the shapes that I've created before. That looks cool to me, I like that. Introduce a bit more on the back end. Let's then go to our colors once again, go to that top color in the 5th column. And again, we're going to look for those areas, so they were definitely in here. And I could even maybe jump to the 3% if I want to, and just bring that through here if I want to create like a big large area, which I do. I want this area here to have like it's a flat plane of snow almost, just sort of in this little valley area here. And maybe it can't land on the top of these areas here and stick. So when you zoom out, you've got this sort of deeper area in here. We'll bring that brush size back down to 1%. We'll maybe create like a couple of little ledges here that the snow is on, and just create like these little ledges. That just looks like it's a flat surface, and then boom, drops all the way off down and into there. We can introduce some on the top edges of the actual peaks as well, just like a couple of areas of snow up here. Again, we've got our shadow tone to add in a second, so this might get removed in a minute. I'm just trying to see if there's any little areas that I can just think about maybe introducing like that, this brightest tone that we're going to introduce here, that we can just refine some shapes. So a little something like up on here. Lovely, a little bit on here too. And some vertical lines, just a few, like so. Let's then go to our colors, grab that bottom color in the 4th column, and just like we did before, we're going to go in behind this peak here, just at the top anyway, and just go over the top of some of that just to really darken up in behind there. I'm going to dip down into there where I can just see that there's a bit of a groove, which we can try and exploit a little bit. Got a dark groove here, which I'm going to again try and exploit. And then back behind here, we'll go left to right, just push that shadow across over towards the left. And just because we're using this sort of little details here doesn't mean it can't be little ridge lines. Just because it's in the shadows is what I mean. Like, we can't create these little ridge lines, etc. It rolls off the back of the peak like so into those areas. Here as well, we'll get back into this, so back end of up here, I'll create a bit more, a couple more lines. And especially in your brighter spots, if you do create the odd sort of line in your brighter spots, it will just take away from them and just just show that there's an overhanging shadow of some sort right next to it somehow. And maybe this peak here is just casting a shadow, so maybe I will just bring that in and push that across quite a bit like so. And just refine this edge a bit more. There we go. And where I've got some groove areas I can see that are sort of on their own, unoccupied, get in there. Create some those vertical lines that we were talking about, just show the layout, and then a few more in here in some of the brighter tones, and especially as it runs down into here, you can literally just let this run out into nothing, because again, it's going to get faded out shortly anyway. You should end up with a little something like this. Of course, we're going to come over here and replicate this as well on this space, so essentially just darkening up the back end over here. This one doesn't need that much love, to be honest with you, which is why we're not focused on it too much. Now, I've just gone ahead and done the same work we just did over on here, just a tiny little sort of touch up in those areas. Now we're going to go ahead and start to introduce the brightest tones that are going to sit on the very top. So we're going to go to our layers and we're going to create a new layer. We'll tap on it and clipping mask it also. And we'll go to our colors and we'll grab the bottom color in the 2nd column. And we're going to introduce the bright spots. Now, primarily they're going to be sort of up here, up on here, here, and then maybe the tiniest little bit there. We're focusing it right up on the top edges only. And we're going to use the same brush we're working with now just to introduce these brighter spots just up on the top edges. So you're following where you've added in all your brightest of your oranges, and then you can let these little spots just run a little bit further away. And again, you're kind of looking for kind of the grooves. Look for where you've added it in on those brightest orange spots, and then just showing where the sun is kissing across onto the top. Now up here we are going to somewhat make this very bright in this space here, and then on this peak as well I've got another little area that I can just introduce some of this lovely yellow tone, couple more little lines and grooves where the lighting's running. We'll just help to show how that light's just spilling across. And again, zoom out, don't get lost in those details, zoom out. Let's go along this edge up here. Couple of little sort of spots on this top edge. That looks lovely. That's nice and sort of quite light, not too strong. Introduce a couple more. Now again, when you introduce these little bits of yellow that just dash off, they just look like it's been caught on a rock or something like that. And you can bring sort of the sun down and into some of these little areas of your shades, but just again trying to add in like a tiny little speck here and there that is getting the light. Now this area over here most definitely also gets a little bit of love too. That's going to come across, and maybe where it just drops down into there, we just keep that a little bit more minimal. You don't want to add in too much. A couple of little dashes again on the back end. And let's go ahead and create, like, you can leave big areas if you want, like where you imagine that maybe the light's not kissing. You know, I'm going to bring that down into here. I'll add some onto this too. Just like a little bit on that top edge, just to kind of show. And I'm really attacking the angles and scribbling all over the place to try and just add a little bit of light onto there. Now that I'm looking really happy with. Let's just bring a little bit more of a larger chunk of light maybe here, and then a couple more little sort of scrapes and just random little dashes and areas of rock that are just catching that light. Let's also brighten up the top area over here too, bringing that across. Couple more scrapes down here, following those avenues of lighter tones that you've created before. Just a tiny bit on that left side, just enough. We don't want it to take away from this end too much. Now, looking at that, I'm really pleased with how that looks. Let's then go ahead and do a little couple of tricks here. We're going to first of all go to the layer, swipe it to the left and duplicate it. We're going to go to our adjustments and Gaussian blur and swipe from left to right. And if we go up to something around about 10% and then tap on our adjustments when we're done, you've now got this lovely sort of soft glow on here where the lighting really is just casting onto the mountain. Looks fantastic. Let's then go ahead and go to our layers, create another new layer, tap on it and clipping mask it. We'll grab the base color, so the bottom color in the 5th column. We're going to go to our brush and go to airbrushing and the soft brush. With the brush size around about sort of 20%, we're going to go left to right at the bottom here and blend that up and take away. So we're just creating like a little bit of a light purple sort of gradient at the bottom here that just goes up and meets a little bit up towards our mountain peaks, but just a tiny bit where you're in the valley and for whatever reason it's not getting too much light. Then let's go to our layers and move forward. Now we can select all of those layers if you like and swipe them from left to right, group them together and collapse that down. We're then going to go to our next set of hills in the front. Now these are going to have very, very basic highlights on them. So we're going to create a new layer, tap on it and clipping mask it. We're going to go to our colors. We're going to go ahead and we're going to grab this color here at the top of that 5th column from the right. We're going to go to our brush. We're going to go to the option of, we're going to go to sketching and we're going to use the artist crayon. Now we're going to go ahead and set the brush size to probably around about 2%. And we're just going to, where you've got a peak, the right hand side only, we're not going to add any shadows. We're just going to try and just create some swooping lines here and there, like a little something like this. And bring that all the way across. You want to link them up a little bit. And this is like your lighter side of this mountain. Just keep it really simple. You've got another one over here, for example. So, you know, I'll create like a couple of little random wiggles here and there, and then just introduce like a brighter spot on there too. And let that just run down. Bring that across, maybe a couple of light streaks towards the bottom will nicely just sort of blend out your line work. You can drop the pen size down to 1% if you want and just add in the odd occasional quite fine little line that you really want to brighten up, like right up on this edge. Here as well, I'll do the same. I'll just introduce like a little brighter spot in there and then a couple of like little just dashes off to the left on their own. Right, the light's wrapping around in some sort. This area is not primarily in the lighting area, so it's a really, really light area of color. And we'll do the same up here too. We'll just introduce a little bit on there, a little bit on there too. A little bit of color. Now that'll obviously vary for you depending on where you've added in all your little details, but that's all we need to do really on this level. The only other thing you can do is if you go to your eraser and you tap on the eraser and you go to the option of sketching and artist crayon as well, with a size of 1%, you can then get in there and start to hack away at this and create little grooves and little areas where the light isn't catching, you can create some really fun and interesting little shapes like there. That's just like a little groove in the mountain. I love this brush. It's another brush that I would otherwise use for mountains and like adding snow to them. It's my favorite one actually for adding in snow onto a mountain, but we'd used a different technique in this one. It's always fun to try to see what other brushes you can use to pull off the same effects. So I'm just leaving a little bit of this left over. And you can see there we've got a much more sort of eroded look to that. Let's then go ahead and move to this layer here. So we're going to tap on that layer. We're going to go to our colors and go to the top row, the second color from the right. We're going to go to our brush. We're going to go to the option of drawing, and we're going to use the little pine brush. Size at the moment set to 9%, and all we're going to do is just try and create like a really simple tiny forest on here. So you can create lots of lines like this, and then just sort of scribble your pen side to side. So we're really just not trying to create nothing too detailed. You can quite literally just zigzag your pen up and down here, as long as you keep it in sort of a vertical fashion. You don't want your lines sort of wonky or going off to the side, but just bringing my pen up and down. I'll get back in there and I'll refine some, don't you worry. But like for example here, I just want to create a very tiny sort of forest on the top end of this. It shows then the scale as well of things around it. Like with these trees being so small and this forest on top of this peak here, we can really sort of give a lot of credit and size and scale to those mountains in the distance, how grand and large they are. Keep going my way along here, creating lots of easy trees. Keep it really simple, just zigzagging your pen up and down, wiggling them in large clumps, and then the occasional one that runs up quite high on its own will look really cool. You can create like large clusters if you want, or something like that. Now this brush might end up where your trees are looking a little bit transparent, so you just need to go to your layer and swipe it to the left and duplicate it. It will block them out a bit more, and then tap on that layer and merge it down. That will make your shapes there a little bit stronger. Let's then go to our layers and go right to the top. For our next set of trees, we're going to create a new layer. We're going to go to our colors and grab the color in the top right of the palette. And we're going to go to our brushes. We're going to go into the option of vintage, and we're going to use the rad brush. I love this brush for creating trees. And we're going to start over here on the right, and we're going to create some fairly large trees. So we're going to bring our brush size down to something around about sort of 2%. And the first thing you always need to do is just draw in a straight line, pop your finger on the screen, and just keep drawing in some fairly large trees. So like here, and then vary up some of the gaps in between, vary up the heights of them, keep some quite close together, some a little bit further away. Ultimately, we want to fill in the majority of this area up here. And then as you get further down, the trees are going to somewhat start to fall off the end here of the hill and get progressively smaller. So you can then introduce like the odd one again, just to show that, you know, there is the odd one sticking up and it is quite a large forest. As we get further down the hillside here, ultimately we want to go down to this block here. So we're right in the middle, and this is ultimately where you kind of want to start to think about your trees just really falling off completely. Like I'll do one maybe down into there, but then after that we will let them be. So we're just drawing in some really simple straight lines. Now these are going to be sort of the trunks of your trees, and once you've got a good collection like this, we're also going to add some over here. We're going to add just two large ones. We're going to introduce one up here, one up here, and this one's going to be quite large up into here. And then we're going to change our brush size to 8%, and we're going to do the same trick I always do. You start at the top and then you go zigzag all the way down, and you get progressively wider as you go. Now 8% might be a little bit too large. We could probably drop that down to about 4, and then just as you get further down, you just get progressively wider like so. And at the bottom, you just want to make sure as your trees start to connect that you go up and down your trunk a couple of times, and then just sort of just blend in the middle of them. Like, you know, where these two trees, the middle in between them, I'm just drawing them back in. We're keeping these trees super clean and easy. Quite abstract as well, nothing too serious. We're not going to get into sort of drawing specific branches or anything, unless you want to sort of add the odd little one like here and there, just sort of running astray like so. It's totally up to you. But I would get the majority in, so start quite narrow at the top and then get quite thin to thicker towards the bottom. So thin at the top, get gradually wider, go up and down it a couple of times, and make sure the tree trunk in the middle is nice and full. And then in these gaps here, just block them in a little bit. We want to create that quite strong forest look. Here I'll create one that's very wide at the bottom and quite thin towards the top. Got our big sort of main focal tree here, really. It's the widest one out of all of them. I'm going to go up and down that a few times, make sure that that's nice and thick in the center, and then blend that along the ground surface in towards. I don't want the forest to have a sort of this monoline floor to it. I want it to have a little bit of rough and tumble to it. A little couple of trees here. And these are really simple. We're going to keep it super, super easy. Super easy. And these are just really fun to do. I find them really therapeutic just to keep going up and down the tree, creating a forest. And once you start to sort of block them in a bit more as well, they look great. They really have some good shape to them. And the brush allows you to sort of add in those branches at a really random level. They the pattern of the shape or whatever sort of they've added to this brush just makes it so random with its scattering, and I love it. Now down here I've got a few that are a little bit sort of far apart from one another. I may get back in there in a second and introduce some more. We'll zoom out and take a look at the whole thing. We'll have a look for balance. We'll have a look for, you know, just areas where we think we can maybe sort of rough up the surface. The odd little flat bit is fine. It's just like a little, maybe it's a little like viewing point almost for this little design. But as long as you can give it a good story, I always say you can make it believable. So that looks really good to me. I'm happy with sort of how big these ones are, and then they get gradually smaller as they make their way down. You could make a couple of these like really, really big, you know, like here I could maybe get in here and bulk out this a little bit more and have a much larger tree up at the top here. Just like that. I've got to make sure it gets a little bit wider as it goes down, but you also want to bear in mind we don't want to take away from our mountains too much, but they do really add to the scene. We've got these two extra ones down here as well. These ones are going to be very large trees, which I think we can maybe go with a larger brush size. If we can get about 5, or we'll try the 8. We'll try the 8 here because they're fairly close trees, these ones, I imagine. They're a little bit closer to us. Let those branches run astray a little bit more. We'll go up and down the column and then branch out from there, no pun intended. Go up and down here, filling in that center column a bit more. I'll drop it down to about 4% again and just let's make sure that is 4%. Create the odd sort of little branch here and there. Because this one's quite in view, I imagine that we need to just introduce quite a little bit more love on it, a little bit more detail. And let's also go ahead and just rough up this surface here just a little bit more, make that a little bit more uneven. There we go, we've added in our main trees. Now we can then go ahead and go to our layers and create another new layer. Go to our brush library, and you're going to need to, of course, have downloaded the deer stamp collection that I've added in the description down below. And once you've got the deer set, I'm going to use deer number 7. And I'm just going to tap in the middle of the screen. The size for a moment is 40%, but we'll change it in a moment. Then I'm going to grab my cursor, I'm going to flip it horizontally, and I'm going to move it down into this spot here, just like so. I want to give it a good amount of size, so I'm going to leave it just like that. You may just need to adjust the shape of your land here, just to try and fit it in. And now we're going to go ahead and add some atmosphere. And this is totally optional. If you like your design at this point, leave it as it is. But we're going to go to our layers. We're going to go ahead and, so we've got these 3 layers at the top. We can group them together. They're done with. That is our top layer here. So we're going to collapse that group down. We've then got this layer here, which is this land here with those trees. We're going to create a new layer in front of it. We're going to go to our colors and grab this color here in the top left of the palette. We're going to go to our brush library, and the first thing we'll do is we will grab the airbrushing, the medium brush. We want the opacity set to 81%, and the size is going to fluctuate, probably around about 2% though. And we're going to just very, very loosely just go round this edge over here, around the edge of the sort of hill, and just bring in some very light mist. So we're just going to push this in across, let it get really, really light, and just occasional just light streak next to it. And we're going to ultimately fill out the bottom area here. So let's do exactly that. Let's go 5% and just go left to right. We're just going to allow that deer to stand out a little bit more. And we can just go in here and maybe really fog this area out and blend that across over to the left. We'll do the same in behind these trees and push in from the left-hand side now as well. And just show kind of the mist just coming round and wrapping into this area. We'll go back down to about 3% and we'll create some lovely blanket mist in here and just gives it a little bit more of an atmosphere. You can bring a lot of this mist further back in the design. We want to sort of keep it to a bit of a minimum a little bit further back. But here in this area, we can kind of show, because it's in the shade, it's not yet burnt off in the morning sun, you know, it's still just sitting around in between the valleys. This deer's just getting a good look at everything. And it's like this little blanket of this colour in here. Now, once you've done a few lines like this and you're happy with it, I'm going to just introduce like a tiny little bit in there. I want to make sure it's super, super light. Once you're happy with it, we can then go to our brush and switch it to this soft airbrush. If you've already added a good amount, you don't need to do this, but I'm going to make my brush size around about sort of 8% and just very lightly just go over this area here, just kind of adding in a light sort of glaze to it, just sort of merging the mist layers and lines that I've drawn, and a little bit up here as well as it just makes its way around, and kind of just merging them together a little bit more, like so. So you can see that low-hanging mist. And if we go to our layers, we're going to go ahead and go in front of those mountains in this sort of middle area. We'll create a new layer in front of them. We will go ahead and go back to the medium brush. Same principles just as we did a second ago, so around about sort of 3 to 2%. And now you can add some mist that just sort of sits in behind here. So now what you draw in just pushes that mist further back in the scene. So we're getting a little bit further back, a little bit closer towards these mountains over here, and just continuing on that little bit of atmosphere. And you kind of also show in the elevation, you know, how high are we? Are we up in the clouds here? You know, where are we? And adding in this mist around here, just, I love this. It just exposes the top of this, just leaves it to its own space, leaves it just sort of poking its head out of everything that's hanging deep in the valley. And let's just wiggle our pen a tiny bit here and there just to create some little wobbles in the mist and push that across over here. I'm going to let this one have a good amount of love. Don't want to make it too bright, but just enough in this valley here, like so, that will look great. Now, this is totally optional, and it depends on how much you want to take away from your main mountains there at the back. But if we go to our layers and we go ahead and in front of that group that I created for it, we create another new layer. First thing you probably want to do is go ahead and change your brush to the soft airbrush. With that brush size around about 8% again, just go left to right, and like down here, you can let that mist just sort of run into the very bottom area, but it's totally up to you then how high you want that to go. You can leave it low like this, and so that those mountains are so big and grand that it doesn't really affect them. They're just hanging like so. Or you can then go ahead and go to your brush and change it to the medium brush again. We can change your brush size to probably around about sort of 3%, and then just introduce like a little bit of mist where you want it to sit. So for example, we can maybe create like a little bit here and just like add in a tiny bit, push it left to right. You can even use a smudge tool if you want as well, just introduce that, but just a tiny bit, just sort of hanging around the mountain. You know, maybe a little bit over here where this is in the shade anyway, so maybe we can introduce this. And just a little sort of couple of wiggles here and there. Just push this across into this space. Maybe a little something like that. Just very low hanging. It's totally up to you. You can also go ahead and reduce your brush size maybe down to about sort of 2%. And where this is maybe getting touched by the light a little bit, you can just, you know, introduce like a really solid line on the top edge of it, just to show that there's a little bit of light just somewhat catching quite close onto the top of this, making it quite a solid shape almost. And then we can go back to a 3% and create some more sort of streaks just underneath here. You don't want that to be too high and floating on its own. You kind of want it to tag into the rest of everything. We'll push this off to the left, introduce another couple of wiggles in here. And to me, that looks lovely. I'm really happy with how that looks. We can always go ahead and tone it down as well, because if it's a little bit further back, you can always go ahead and tap on the layer, just bring the opacity down a little bit, maybe down to about sort of 66% or something. So it's there, but it's very, very light. And we can go up to our actions. We can turn off our drawing guide, which gets rid of the grid. And if you're happy with your design, you can pinch your 2 fingers, you can go full screen with 4, and you end up with today's finished design. So I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed this part of the process. I know it was a little bit different, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like down below and drop a comment as well, letting me know what you thought of today's tutorial. As always, please be sure to share your designs with me over on Instagram by tagging me in your finished creations. And you can also share your designs with my community over on Discord Both will be linked in the description down below. As always, a massive shout out to all of my patrons who help make these videos possible. If you want to get access to a catalogue of nearly 80 exclusive tutorials with 3 more added every single month, have your name featured in videos, sneak peeks of upcoming designs, early access to tutorials and much more, hit the link in the description down below. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, you'll probably like this one here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.